Ben Shamgochian, and John Hagan is not here, but representing his work as well with our Climate Common. This is really exciting. I'm really excited to hear about this work. I've been hearing about it for some time. The title is New Opportunities for Old Forest Conservation, How a Good Map is a Game Changer. Ben is a research associate with our Climate Common, where he's focused on forest ecology and commercial forest landscapes. For the last 3 years, he's been working with Dr. John Hagan to map late successional and old growth in the forests, and LSOG is how they refer to it, so you'll probably hear that. For the unorganized townships of Maine. Working with remote sensing data, Ben developed a hectare resolution map of LSOG forests for 10 million acres of the Maine North Woods. Ben holds a BS in biology from Tufts University. And John Hagan is the founder of our Climate Common. Previously, he was chair of the Maine Climate Table and president of Manomet, a nonpartisan, science-driven sustainability nonprofit, for 11 years. He's partnered with many for-profit sectors on sustainability, including large timberland owners, farmers, institutional investors, retailers, fishermen, and many others. He received the Austin Wilkins Award from Maine Governor John Baldacci for his work on the stewardship and conservation of Maine's forests, and the Integrity and Conservation Award from the New England Society of American Foresters. So, Ben, I want to welcome you and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk. Yes, as Liz just said, my name's Ben Shamgochian, and I've been working on this project for the last 3 years, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. So basically, we've been mapping late successional and old growth forests, or LSOG as we call them. We produced a map for 10 million acres of the unorganized townships in Maine. And this has really been a game changer for conservation. While a map, a model is never going to be perfect, it's useful to have. So this has given us some direction for where the old forest is, who owns it, tells us how fast we're losing it, which is something we didn't really know before. And it just gives us a springboard to do conservation work. So I'd like to highlight our work, tell you what we've been doing, and then briefly some of the things that have been possible with this map. So Linda gave you a very good history of forestry in Maine. I'm going to do this much faster and less eloquently. Maine, the northern halves of Maine, is unlike most places in New England in that most of it has never been cleared for agriculture. So there's a lot of continuity in these forests, unlike forests in Massachusetts, which were cleared in the 1800s. But that doesn't mean these forests are untouched. This is a map of all of the commercial timberlands today in Maine. More of this was commercial timberlands in the past. It's been heavily harvested over the last 200 or 250 years. It's harvested so heavily that most areas in Maine have actually been cut over like more than once, which is just very impressive. This is not, necessarily a bad thing. It provides us with locally sourced wood products, which are really important, and it supports rural communities, although that has been declining recently. It should be supporting rural communities. But it does mean that most of the forests in Maine are relatively young. There's still, though, some really special places out there that through quirks of topography, or in some cases it seems just dumb luck, have avoided being harvested or have only been lightly touched. And these are the LSOG forests of this region. While some of them are hidden in little nooks and crannies on the sides of mountains, others are oddly just fairly large stands on seemingly optimal grounds for timber harvesting. And it's kind of a mystery as to why they were missed over the last 200 years. These stands have unique biodiversity and high levels of carbon that is not found in the younger forests of the region. But due to their sporadic distribution, there's been no systematic inventory of these stands. You can't just walk out in 10 million acres and find all of it. So it's been really hard to get an idea of how much is actually out there. And again, without knowing where it is and who owns it and how fast you're losing it, it's really hard to, get a statewide conservation plan for what we should do with our old forest. So the most extensive survey of old forests was conducted by Charlie Cogbill and others in the early 1980s. They went out in northern Maine and some parts of southern Maine, followed up on word-of-mouth reports by foresters, and found 68 reference old-growth sites. Was really successful work. They found these reference sites that was incredibly valuable, but it's impossible, again, to employ this across the 10 million acres. You cannot walk all of these forests. They said in wrapping up their report that the exact amount and locations of old-growth forest will remain hidden until a more productive quantitative methodology can be developed. And this really resonated with us. It made us wonder what methodology that could be, and we struck on trying to use LiDAR to develop this methodology that can find old forest no matter how remote it is or who owns it. So LiDAR, just a brief overview of it, it stands for light detection and ranging. It's a kind of active remote sensing in which laser pulses are shot from an airplane or whatever you mount the sensor on. It could even be a satellite, but in our case, an airplane. You fly the airplane over the forest. It shoots down laser pulses. Those pulses hit an object, either the canopy or the ground or somewhere in the mid-story, and get bounced back. And somehow, the technology is able to calculate the time difference between when that photon was shot out and it returned, and use that to calculate the distance of the object. So when you fly LiDAR over a forest and you shoot out billions of laser beams, you can get incredibly detailed images of forest structure. It's like a 3D CAT scan of the forest. So this is somewhat of an oblique angle, but it kind of shows you, this is a stand that's been cut over with a white pine overstory. The colors symbolize height, so the reds are taller forest here. And you can see incredibly detailed things in these 3D maps. You can see individual tall trees like this. You can see the crown structure of the trees. You can see, where the skid roads went through. You can see lower forest. If you were to zoom in, you could even see large downed logs in the forest floor. Even with the publicly available LiDAR we have, we can see large downed logs. And you can see things like tree fall gaps in old growth forests. So it gives you a lot of structural information. So here's just an example of what an LSOG stand looks like in a LiDAR image. It's the stand in the center here that really stands out. And the colors here symbolize height again, and this stand stands out because it is incredibly tall. The stands around it, the yellows and the oranges symbolize lower heights, about 2 to 12 meter tall forests. They're very even canopy, whereas the LSOG stand in the center, which is taller heights, the blues and the magentas, have a much more rugose canopy, which is often found in the older stage late successional forests. So while we could look at these images, this already makes it easier than walking through all 10 million acres of the forest. It would be really good to automate this because that would take a lot of time and it would be pretty subjective. So here's the process. The formatting, like a lot of people's today, is a little messed up. Pretend it looks nice. Here's the process we came up with for automating this process of identifying LSOG. The first step was to characterize the forest structure from the LiDAR. So we wanted to take LiDAR statistics and then calculate that for the entire study area so that we knew what the forest looked like for the entire place. So to do that, we chose 8 LiDAR metrics derived from the canopy height. These were 3 metrics of canopy height, 2 of canopy evenness, so getting at that rugosity in some of the older forests, and then 3 metrics of canopy coverage, which also gets at the 3D structure of these older forests. And we chose these because we thought these would help us, after looking at a lot of canopy height models, would help us identify LSOG. The second step was we had now all of this 3D data. We needed to correlate it to what's actually on the ground. So we needed reference plots. We needed to do a lot of field work. And we wanted to collect plots from an array of forest types and ages, and then we could correlate those LiDAR stats for those plots and then potentially build a model that could extrapolate. So just an important note is we focused on what we call the operable zone. So we're not looking at stunted high elevation spruce forests or spruce flats or really stunted black spruce flats. We're looking at the places that are most often harvested. So those are the northern hardwood forests on good soils and the spruce fir forests that are upland sites. So we're not looking at the stunted forests. We're hoping to do that in the future at some point. We collected 463 plots that range from clear cuts to old growth forest. And then, since we're trying to map this, we have to deal with the dirty issue of classification. I know classification is out these days for good reason. But for an exercise like this, we kind of had to simplify it. We're trying to work so that foresters could use these maps, and we wanted it to be really as simple as we could get it. So no like scales of LSOG characteristics from 0 to 99 or something like that. We decided on this system. So at the lowest level, we have what we called not LSOG. And these were anything from clear cuts to mid-age forest. We just needed to, we had a lot of data for this, 253 sites, and we wanted to just map that out basically. We need to be able to map that well. And then we have the 3 LSOG classes. These we broke into 3 classes because we could see the differences structurally on the ground between the early stage late successional forest and the late stage or old growth forest. And we could also see the differences in the LiDAR. So we thought it was a worthwhile exercise to break those out to give you quality basically of the forest. So the youngest of these was transitioning LS, and this is forest that contains some element of LS features. If it's a forest that's becoming over mature and is developing those features, or if it's a forest that was older that was partially harvested but still retains some of those LS features. Next, we have our LS category. These are stands that have not been touched in a long time. They're starting to develop those natural old forest gap phase dynamics. You're getting big trees that are going over, but there is some evidence that it was harvested in the past. And lastly, we have old growth, which we define as having no signs of human intervention. And that we have very few data points for that. We have only 17, which limits our inference for that currently, but we're working on improving our modeling of old growth. So now we have everything we need to build a model. We applied a random forest classification scheme that correlated those LiDAR data with the reference plots. We then applied that model to the study area to predict the LSOG class of 4.2 million hectares. That's a lot easier said than done. It needed a supercomputer to do all of that, but that was basically the process. So this is what we started with. This is the LiDAR map. You see all of the black squares, they're a hectare. So we calculated those 8 stats for every single hectare. We ran those through the model we just built, and it gave us this. So just for the symbology, the whites are not LSOG. We kind of needed to erase those out of the scene. The greens are the transitioning LS class. The light blues are late successional, and then the dark blues we called old growth-like. We're only putting quotes around that because currently our classification isn't very good for old growth-like. It can often misclassify them as LS, but we're working on improving that in the future. But we just don't want to use a loaded term like that with forestry communities and not give some kind of a hedging for that currently. So if you back this out, at the landscape level, here's the northern half of our study area. We see about 20% of the study area is in this LSOG condition, which was really good news. We were not expecting to find that much. But most of that, about 15% of that, is in this transitioning LS condition. So it's been heavily disturbed, but still has some element of late successional characteristics. Again, though, we shouldn't ignore these because these are the LS forests of the future. If you want a lot of this stuff in the future, you should, first of all, focus on these places because they're closest to becoming LS. If we back it up to just the highest 2 classes, the LS and the OG-like, they make up about 4% of the study area, 160,000 hectares. That's a much grimmer picture. And then lastly, we wanted to validate the model. We wanted to see how good it was. So we went out and we randomly sampled stands. We found, just a brief overview, we found about 90% effectiveness in differentiating the LSOG class from the not LSOG class. So it was really good at telling if it was a younger forest or in one of those 3 LSOG classes. For the transitioning LS versus LS, it was about 75% effective at that. When we were doing the validation work, we didn't come across any true old growth, so we weren't able to calculate a effectiveness rate for that. But generally, it's really good at identifying the late successional transitioning LS and not LSOG. The main thing that we want to note is that tall aspen stands, especially tall aspen stands that are old growth tall aspen stands that have a lot of that old growth structure, the big old trees dying out, can confuse the model. either rightly or wrongly, we've got some of those in the model. There's a lot of ecological value, just on the side note, of those aspen stands, we think. Whatever the case, I just wanted to reiterate that the model is not designed currently for forested wetlands and high elevation zones. We wanted to focus on where forestry operations happen most often, which is in those operable zones. Although recently we have been seeing a lot and hearing from a lot of people that late successional cedar is being cut really quickly. So we're hoping to expand our modeling to LS cedar stands. And just something, this was one of the gems that we found. We came across this 700-acre tract of true old growth with this model. We did not know this existed out there. We saw it light up on the map and we went out to it. This is not when we were doing the validation data, but we went out to it and it turned out to be true, and we've walked this entire thing and it's just exceptional. And we didn't know there were 700-acre tracts of old growth. We're trying to keep this on the down low right now, so we're not really sharing the location, but we're trying to work with the landowners on this stand. It's not imminently threatened by harvest, so that's something that's important. It's in northern Maine. That's a really good question of, where are these stands and who owns them? So here's a very brief overview because I don't have much time. But this is a broad breakdown of LS and old growth like by different ownership types. So the study area you see at the top, we have 161,000 hectares in total. The main thing looking at this that I want to highlight, there's a lot to highlight here, but I don't have much time, is that the forest industry owns about half of this. They own a lot of land, and they own about half of the LSOG. And this is probably the forest that we should focus on first. Public lands are, the forests there are a lot safer than the forests on these industrial timberlands. We also wanted to look at how quickly we're losing these LSOG stands. How quickly are they being harvested? To do that, we used a data set called the Global Forest Watch. And it basically, I won't go into the details, but it tells you where canopy change has happened. And in our neck of the woods, most of that canopy change is harvest, like you see all of these harvest blocks here. And this scene shows all of the harvests that have occurred since the LiDAR was flown. So the LiDAR stopped being flown in 2019 for our region. So this is all of the harvests that have occurred from 2019 to 2024. We don't have the current year of data. So we overlaid this data on our map to see what has been lost in that time period. And we found for LS and old growth like, that about 2,200 hectares are being lost per year. That's a hard number to really conceptualize. So what we did is we did this calculation, assuming this rate is held steady into the future, it will take, by 2058, we will have lost half of the LSOG, the LS and old growth like that we have today. So we're losing it really quickly. And it just kind of shows the urgency. This picture here is that first stand I showed you in the LiDAR, the canopy height model. And we're counting, it was recently harvested this summer, which was unfortunate. We're counting tree rings in that stand, and we had many that were north of 250 years. And that was just like a regular old LSOG stand that we're mapping, and we got some good ages from that stand. So lastly, and most importantly, now that we have this map, which is, it's good enough to be effective for conservation, what can we do with it? So the first thing that we've been doing with it is, since the commercial landowners own half the stands, and these are the stands that are most at risk of harvest, we thought that it's most important to start with them. So we've been working with them to identify the LSOG stands on their lands. These commercial timberlands and the industry here, they're not really thinking about LSOG value. They're thinking about, where's my big wood? And that's why they're cutting it so quickly. They're not targeting LSOG, but they're targeting high volume stands, which often happen to be the LSOG stands that we're looking at. So we're trying to, to teach them about how to identify these stands. They have to be keeping track of LSOG stands for their certification. So this is important with them. Brian is working a lot more with commercial timberland owners, and he will tell you a lot more about his work on this. But secondly, this has been a real boon for land trusts, because if they want to target LSOG, previously they didn't really have any good way of knowing exactly where it was or how much there were in different places. You'd have to go on the ground or have stand maps, and those are not always available. So this is a map that the Maine Appalachian Trail Land Trust asked us for. And they wanted to look at, they wanted to buy some land along the A2 corridor, which is that little squiggly line you see. And they gave us a buffer they wanted, the buffer width. And they asked us, where's all the LSOG in that? Where can we, target acquisitions that have old forest? And then lastly, and probably most importantly, is that our work gave some concrete context to NRCM about the issue of old forest on commercial lands in Maine more broadly. It gave them a lot of data of generally how much is there, how at risk is it, where is it, and they were able to use some of that data to come out with this draft of a bill, LD 1529, which just passed this summer, which is focused on LSOG conservation. So this bill, one part of it is that the Maine Forest Service has to develop a plan, strategies for LSOG conservation. So that has been very important, and I think will continue to be very important. So this was just a 15-minute overview of what's been 3 years of work. We've got a lot more information. If you want it, you can go to our report we just put out, or you can talk to me after, ask me any questions in the Q&A. And with that, I'd like to say thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So we're going to save questions for after
Okay,
the
sounds
talk,
good.
after the next talk.